Friends, fam, listeners, I must ask you, on what other podcast are you going to go from quantum cryptography one week to biblical prophecy the next? What other podcast? You can't get content like this anywhere else. I dare you to try. All right. Words is becoming like my favorite thing that I do all week. So if you're new here, welcome. On Fridays, we talk about translation. We don't always wear pink on Wednesdays, but we always talk about translation on Fridays, and that's the Words series. I take your questions at rejoiceevermore.substack.com, and sometimes they lead me into fun and kooky places. Today, I have an excellent question about last week's episode on encryption. So last week, I did a whole episode about encryption and codes, and I said that they are different from translation in an important and interesting way. Translation takes the underlying meaning of the text and gives it a new outward form, gives it a new surface level of words and sounds and syllables. Encryption takes the surface level as it already is, doesn't change it at all, and just scrambles it or reroutes it into a new pattern that has an identifiable, usually mathematical connection to the original surface. So you haven't done anything beneath the surface of the meaning of the words, but you've done something very complicated to the surface so that the surface will become unrecognizable and illegible to anybody except somebody that knows how to undo the code. And the whole project is to find the most complicated way of scrambling the letters, the routes of transmission that can be unscrambled by somebody who has the key to the code, but can't be unscrambled by somebody that doesn't. And I talked about this at the level of ciphers from the 1600s all the way down to today in quantum cryptography and using photons and their indeterminacy to build an unbreakable code key. But I stressed that there's an important difference here between translation and encoding, which is that encoding only scrambles the surface and unscrambles the surface. Translation goes beneath the surface and reclothes what's underneath the surface. And that is why computers can do encryption better than us, because they work with numbers, which are the absolute definite surface of things. But they can't do translation except as a kind of mimicry. They can mimic and guess at translation, but they can't do what we do when we translate, which is get beneath the skin of the words, and therefore computers can't judge whether a translation is right. Ultimately, it's a human that decides whether the computer is getting the translation right, whereas a computer can very easily get a code right and hand on the results to a human reader who will understand the meaning of the text. So Blaine, listening to this episode, writes in and asks, are prophecies encoded messages or translations? They seem like they have aspects of both. That's a really cool question. So a prophecy, that is, I take it to mean a human being speaking the word, the inspired words of God, acting as a channel or a conduit for divine truth. Is that a process of encryption, meaning the message is given to the prophet, and then all the prophet does is kind of move around the pieces or layer it over in some way that the people reading it either can or can't understand based on their spiritual insight, or translation in that what the prophet receives from God is something that couldn't be expressed in words, and then the prophet does the translation into human language, human speech and verbiage. And I think there are really two questions contained here in one. The first is the one I just alluded to. How are prophecies received? What's the experience of the prophet like when he gets the message and then puts it on paper or says it in the streets? And then the second question is, how should we interpret prophecies? Should we be thinking of ourselves as cracking a code and just trying to get the one-to-one correspondence? This symbol means this when it comes up here, and this mention of this church means that you're going to get this country at war and this year and date and so forth. And of course, many people have tried to do this with doomsday prophecies especially, and tried to read world events as a kind of encrypted prophecy. Or should we be engaged in a process of translation, that is, trying to move past the surface level of the text to the spirit of the word, to the kind of ineffable divine thing that was communicated? Now, these questions are interrelated, so I can't answer without talking about them both, but The question of how prophets do prophecy is way above my pay grade. Even if I didn't believe that our primary model for prophets should be biblical prophets, and even leaving aside the question, are there still prophets? Do people still do prophecy? Is that over? Is it unbiblical to say that prophecy is still happening, or what? One thing I can tell you with absolute certainty is I ain't no prophet. I am not a prophet. I don't speak the word of God unmediated and perfectly to you directly from on high. I think I commune with God and communicate through prayer with God and try to discern what he's saying to me. But I take a prophet. I understand the concept of prophecy to come at least at the bare minimum to come associated with a degree of lucidity and clarity and certainty in the channel of transmission, however that channel is formed, that I simply do not have, and that is special and unique, which is why we have a word for the prophet. And in the Bible, people are prophets. They don't just do prophecy, they are prophets. However, all of that having been said, there are some clues in the language that I think we can use to think about and understand what it might look like to be a prophet. And the first is in that word that I've been using and that connection between the word and the action. You are a prophet and you prophesy. And this is a word in English that pretty perfectly reflects the structure of the word in both Greek and Hebrew. We don't often get this, a word that is etymologically isomorphic, that is, its deep verbal structure is identical to the structure in all the biblical languages. But prophet is one such word that if you translate it into the different languages, you'll have the same etymology, basically, going back. So prophet is a Greek-rooted word. It comes from Greek, prophemi, and that means to speak forth. Pro is forth, and phemi is speak. It's one of our words for speak. And this is where we get our words like emphatic, because the adjectival form of phemi in English becomes phatic. And in fact, there's even a word just phatic, which is not an insult, but means something like pronunciatory. It has this pronunciating quality to it. But emphatic, emphasis, these are all from the same root as prophecy and prophetic, which mean to speak forth something. That's also how the word is structured in Hebrew. The Hebrew word for prophet is navi, and it's related to a bunch of other Semitic words from other Semitic languages, like Akkadian, for instance, meaning to speak forth. And in Hebrew, the connection between nouns and verbs is even tighter. Almost every word can be both a noun and a verb, depending. And so to nava, I nava, means I speak forth, or I proclaim, I utter. And the navi, the prophet, is just one who proclaims and one who utters. What is he uttering? That's what Blaine is trying to get at. What's the thing that the prophet speaks forth or pronounces? Well, one clue, I think, is that the prophet is kind of the human version of the angel. And there's a very tight relationship that isn't as clear in the English language version there's a very tight connection in the biblical languages between these prophet, navi, prophemi words and the words that we translate as angel. And that's a word that has suffered over time through its use and abuse in translation, because an angel now sounds to us like a little fluttery, white-winged, robed guy that sort of flickers around you, kind of like a different Navi, not Navi the prophet, but Navi the navigation device in Zelda, the little sparkle guy, right, that flickers around you and says, hey, listen, right? That is not what the word angel actually technically means. The word angelos in Greek just means messenger. And in fact, if you read a Greek tragedy and the messenger comes on stage and he tells you so-and-so has died, or there's been a terrible battle that has killed many people, or whatever, that's referred to as the angelos, just a human guy delivering a message, presumably with relative faithfulness as to its contents, but in his own words. This is also the Hebrew word malach, which is what we often translate as messenger, can also mean angel. And so our idea of the angel, there are other words, many other words in Hebrew to describe different ranks of angels, the seraphim, the cherubim, but the word messenger also means angel, and that gets picked up in Greek. And it gets picked up in English too, etymologically, but not with the same kind of force as what angel originally means, which is just some kind of messaging force. And it can be a human, but it can also be an incorporeal or a superhuman entity. And this is where I think, even if we're not all prophets, we probably do, without realizing, experience the phenomena that the biblical authors experienced and described as angelic visitations. Not every angel encounter in the Bible can be explained this way, but some can, I think. When we say that we had this bolt from the blue, that something hit us or some idea popped up to us, unbidden in our heads, that seemed to cut against the grain of our previous thoughts. That feels like a kind of divine revelation. And there is certainly an underlying material component to it. There's something going on physically in your brain when that happens. But the experience of it is categorically different from the experience of thinking your own thoughts. And I believe that if you take the Bible seriously, you have to at least contemplate the possibility that there are entities capable, at least in part, of shaping that non-corporeal thing that distinguishes your thoughts from somebody else's thoughts as they pop into your head. And that might not always be a good thing, because there's angels and there's demons, and I think they both operate on this plane of not the physical material thing, but the thing that the physical material thing expresses, the spiritual plane, the incorporeal plane. And they act through arranging the spiritual world or moving through the spiritual world in such a way that the physical world kind of responds and gives you those neuronal firings or whatever ganglia are going off to really key you into that particular intuition that you had. And if we didn't believe that this could happen in some way, we wouldn't pray. That this is prayer. And also, I think you pray in the trust that some of your intuitions at least are going to be guided. You might not be able to say which ones, because if you could, you might be a prophet, but we think that that's out there. And that is, I think, the evidence in our lives of what the biblical writers would have called angelic activity. So I would suggest that since an angel is a messenger and a prophet is one who speaks forth, that a prophet is just a human version at the human level of the hierarchy, down from the spiritual ranks of the angels into this spiritual and material body called a human body. A prophet is, at a human level, what an angel is at a spiritual level. And they have different functions defined by their different places on the hierarchy. An angel can commune with you in ways that a prophet can't. A prophet can't do telepathy and get inside your head, but he can rub ashes in his hair and roll on the ground and marry a prostitute and sit among the potsherds and all that stuff. And so his physical embodiment is a part of his message. And that is how he speaks forth whatever it is that he is encountering. Now, there's a version of this that would view that process of speaking forth in the physical material plane of a spiritual truth as a process of dictation. And that basically would just be encryption. Encryption being the surface of things. The message has already come readily packaged in a way that is unambiguous, perfectly without need for interpretation or translation, and that simply comes and the prophet takes dictation. I don't think that that can really be what Christians believe about prophecy. I think some Christians do believe that, and I don't think it's like a mortal sin or something to believe that. But I think if we believed that, we might be Muslims. This is kind of what the Quran is supposed to be. Quran means recitation, and the prophet, importantly, Muhammad, when he received this message from Gabriel, or Jibril, I think it is in Arabic, he gets this message from Gabriel that he just takes down, and he can't read or write before this happens, and then he can, and this is this miracle that's supposed to occur, and then it's a recitation, then it's a Quran. And I think that that is one view that totally distinguishes the Muslims from the Christians. Again, I'm saying that just as a descriptive claim now, even before getting into normative claims about which one you should be. I don't think that that's what we believe, because if we did believe that, what would be the point of the prophet in the first place? If we believe in angels and we believe in prayer and we believe that God communicates through his creation, why would you need a human to serve the special role of prophecy? And I think the answer has to be that the reception of a prophecy and the conveying of a prophecy is not an act of encryption, but is something akin to an act of translation. If God could simply inject all that he is and all that we must be directly into us without compromising our free will and without forcing our assent to faith, then he would. But that's not possible, as in it's a logical contradiction in terms for God to be fully present to us and for us to have free will and to think and reason and to embody the Godhead in our role as image bearers of God. And that's our role here, is to, in some sense, translate the divine entity into the material world. We do it very imperfectly. Each one of us does it in a limited way. But if there weren't a role for that somewhere, for some mediator between the spiritual and the physical, and if the spiritual, therefore, weren't incapable of entering directly into the physical, then we wouldn't need not only prophets or translation, but just the material world. We wouldn't need this creation. We wouldn't need you and me and us, right? That's part of God's plan, seems to be he has judged it good, to pour his spiritual goodness into this physical vessel and to make this, I would call it an allegorical or even a sacramental creation. How does he speak into that creation? Well, I think he enters with particular force into the minds of certain people who then learn how to say things. Now, a point against my argument would be that God sometimes says to prophets, tell them this. Say to the people this, and then starts talking. But I would suggest to you that if you go and examine those passages, first of all, it's very unclear where the quotation marks are supposed to be open and where they're supposed to be closed. That is where God has his quote, and then where the prophet starts speaking and then starts commenting. Sometimes the prophet starts commenting on what God has said. But second of all, you have to understand that when the prophet says, God told me this, and then says the words, you are already receiving the results of the process of prophecy. So you're receiving even the words that are dictated by God in the words of the prophet. And again, if God didn't need or want that to happen in some way, he would have told you. He would have just called you up on the phone. You didn't need the prophet unless there is some kind of process of embodiment going on. And I think that's a much more realistic and also logically consistent way to think about the role of prophets in the world, these prophetic acts that they do, that their prophecy isn't actually limited to words, but includes physical actions, includes symbols and allegories, all trying to get at, clothe in language, this thing that is above and beyond the material world, but is trying to enter in through creation and through prophecy. This turns out to be important, that we think about prophecy as translation rather than as encryption, because then it affects how we undo or decode what we receive. If we thought that a prophecy was an encryption, then we might think, well, our job is to crack the code. And many, many people have thought this. This is something that people do all the time. Doomsday cults are not the only ones, but there are doomsday cults that try to get numbers, numerology out of the text, try to divide it up by the right number of syllables and this and that, and just test out different, basically encrypted keys to pinpoint the day when the resurrection is going to happen for us all, or the day when the world's going to end and the moon's going to turn to blood, and all that stuff. I would suggest that that is using methods of encryption on a text that cries out to be translated. And the reason it's difficult is because it's not crying out to be translated from one language to another exactly, but from language itself, human language, the small our little words of sound and flesh, to translate from that into the divine. And the prophecy is, we must trust, the best vessel for delivering that to us. But our stance of reception is not, I don't think, the stance of the code cracker, but rather the stance of the translator, who is trying to open himself to the subcutaneous meaning of the words, under the surface of the words. And one point I have in favor of this assertion is that prophecy decryption basically never seems to work in advance. It never seems to work forward. You can always point backward and say that was the fulfillment of that prophecy. I'm going to get to that in a bit. But this famously, these doomsday cults, right, are always selecting a date and then failing to be raptured. And that's, I think, what you would expect if you read other parts of Scripture where Jesus is like, no man knows the hour, not even the Son of God, i.e. not even Jesus, who's talking to you, knows precisely when it's going to happen. That's not why we're given prophecy. We're given prophecy to understand what is happening and what is working out and what kind of trajectory we are on, but not, importantly, to be able to skip to the end of the story in advance. Because if we could do that, then there wouldn't be any need to tell the story. Obviously, the process and the unfolding is part of it, and that means that prophecy is a translation of spiritual reality, which needs then to be not decoded, but translated back or opened up, cracked open for its core meaning. And that process, too, is part of God's will for how he is communicating with the words. It's for you to sit with and meditate on these prophecies and come to understand them. So let me give you an example of how I think this works. And it's from a prophecy that I have some experience with because I wrote a translation of it. I will link to this in the description of the episode here in a bit. But I wrote a translation of the book of Isaiah, which is 66 books, magisterial major prophecy that has played a huge role in Christian teaching, especially because many parts of it seem to point toward Jesus. And I'm going to get into a part of that in a second, but I just want to read you a few short lines from the prophecy of Isaiah as translated by me. It's chapter 4. And 7 women will clutch at one man on that day. They'll tell him, "We'll eat our own food. We'll wear our own clothes. Just let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace." 4 lines, pretty simple. This seems, on the face of it, like one of these cryptic prophetic prophecies, right? This is one of these things where they're always talking about, like, who is the guy wearing the shoes on his head with the staff and getting broken and the staff of bread and whatever. So it sort of feels like that. Who are these 7 women? Who is this one man? And that those sorts of questions, prophecy does work in part by inviting you to ask those sorts of questions. What does this mean? And it is artistic in the sense of using that imagery to arrest your attention and to shock you out of the normalcy of life. This is not a normal scene, 7 women clutching at one man. But we can go too far in the other direction if we say there's nothing that this is referring to that we can say with any definiteness. In fact, the prophecy of Isaiah is specifically useful because there is an historical event that it is at least in part about. And those who don't believe that prophets can tell the future have devoted much argumentation to show that actually the book of Isaiah is not taking place, or at least parts of the book of Isaiah doesn't take place in the pre-Babylon era, but after the events that it describes. But if you believe in prophecy and you don't accept the textual arguments, then you can start to think, well, let's imagine that this passage, which is quite early on, does refer forward to a specific historical event, which is the exile in Babylon. The signal cataclysm of pre-Christian Jewish history is the exile in Babylon. It comes at the end of a long line of many prophets talking to many kings who are gradually apostatizing, moving away, culturally declining more and more, until finally God brings the only last thing he knows how to communicate to his people. It's a last resort for God to allow the Babylonian Empire to overthrow Jerusalem and to reveal that even though God has his kingdom in Jerusalem, he is not limited by any physical place, but can go in exile, into exile with the Jews, and so on and so forth. All of this is kind of the core, really, of what would become the Jewish religion that we now know. And Isaiah is about this. So it's about total civilizational decline and disaster when Nebuchadnezzar comes, sacks the city, and pulls you out east into his capital city. So there is what you would call, in typical church traditional language, a literal or a historical reading of this passage. I've talked before on the show about the 4 different kinds of readings, but I'm going to take you through them now so that you see how some of this works. On that day, in that case, would refer to the day of the exile in Babylon, when Jerusalem falls. What will happen then? Well, you'll have 7 women clutching at one man to say, "We'll eat our own food, we'll wear our own clothes, just let us be called by your name." What happens in exile and in war? Women are particularly vulnerable, especially in societies like the one that Isaiah is talking to, and they need a husband or a father or a protector to run the economic household, because economically speaking, men were in charge. And so women, the widows, the reason they're always talking about the widow and the orphan in the Bible is because those are the ones who are left without an adult male to supervise the household and to help them. And that's why it's important that the very next thing the women say is, "We'll eat our own food. We'll wear our own clothes." In other words, we don't need economic security. This is apparently the one man who hasn't been touched by the disaster, who remains economically secure and his household is stable. And these 7 abandoned women, lost women, are coming to him. It looks like asking to be married to him, to become his wives. "Just let us be called by your name," or at least become members of his household. But they're saying, we're not going to be a burden. We will bring our own dowries. We come fully stocked with a pantry and a wardrobe each. Just take away our disgrace. Take away the shame, they're saying, of being cast out, which comes with exile, comes perhaps with the death of their former husbands. That, I think, would be a pretty natural, literal reading of the text as about a historical event. And notice, importantly, that the literal reading does not mean the physically absolute reading. That is, just because it's the reading that the most directly applies the text to an event doesn't mean that every word in it is locked into its absolute physical meaning. For example, in the day of Babylon, there were probably way more than 7 women trying to seek shelter. So this is not about, it says 7 women, but even though it says 7 women, it's not about 7 women. If there were 8, if there were 100, if there were 5, Isaiah would still be right, because 7 is the biblical number of completeness. And so this is basically saying all women will be in this state, and they will be reaching out for the one man that can help them. And they just need somebody. He's giving you a vision of a time when total social collapse, maybe not in these specific physical terms, but what this expresses is truer than if it were literally happening right in front of you, because that's what it's going to be like on that day. That's the literal reading. The next reading would be a moral or an ethical reading, which would consist in saying, well, okay, so that's going to happen, but we're now reading this prophecy 2024. What do we care? Well, there's moral insight in it for us. We can draw out moral lessons and a moral picture of the world. And actually, in that way, it's quite profound, because if you think about modern theories, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the ideas of some of the more economically minded among us, there's this going idea that you can only even think about higher order moral concerns once you've got bread on the table and food to eat and clothes and all that. And once you have sorted all of your material needs. And that's why we can't expect those poor people to be virtuous. Of course they're going to descend into barbarity. Now, I don't want to deny that being poor and poverty is a terrible obstacle to, it makes everything much harder, and that includes moral rectitude. But actually, under the cover of compassion, this view of things that you must have your economic needs met before you can think about your spiritual needs is quite contemptuous, because it suggests that the poor have no moral agency. And here we're getting a slightly different picture that I think is both truer to life and truer to the actual poor people whom I have seen desperately need spiritual food as well as physical food, but also more noble, that in fact, even in abject situations when the material world is going really badly and you have all these other material needs, you still care about your soul. In fact, among the poor, there are people who are very deeply concerned about their soul, and often being in poverty leads people to think more about the other things in life that Jesus tells them mean more. So there is an ancient, but I think more sophisticated view than the typical modern view here about the role of moral needs in relation to material needs. So there's something profound to get out of the prophecy that doesn't have to do with its particular historical situation or its literal reading. But prophecy, I think, is special in particular because we expect it not just to have these two meanings, but also to have special allegorical meaning. And this is the third kind of reading that you might do. Allegory is when the historical reality or the literal meaning of the text then stands in as a kind of type or a miniature of a larger spiritual situation. Often for Christians, this involves reading the Old Testament with a view toward the New Testament. And of course, it would be hard for a Christian not to do that in this passage. It wouldn't be hard for a Jewish person to do that, because if you don't believe that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies, then you could say this is about any number of other things. And that's why it's not really fair to Jews to say, well, how could they possibly miss it? Well, it's like there's lots of other readings of this passage, as we've just shown. It's just that for Christians who believe in Jesus, you can very much see how this would be a picture of Jesus. People bereft, lost, 7, the whole world lost, and in the position of war widows, in need of what? Of virtue. The whole world. In the exile of Babylon, which many saints have said is a type of our spiritual captivity, original sin has brought us low. We have no fine clothes. We have only rags, morally speaking. Just give us your name. Let us be called by Jesus' name. Take away our disgrace. It's a perfect picture for a Christian, an allegorical picture of what humanity says to Jesus. We can take care of the material stuff. We have what we need to run our animal bodily lives. We need the absolution of Jesus, the blood of Christ, right? So that would be the allegorical reading here that a Christian would give. And for prophecy, we look also for anagogical readings, which are readings that point us in some way toward the end of days or toward the ultimate cosmic things. Now, this kind of reading is in very much both in keeping with the Jewish and the Christian approach to the text, because prophecies often, and certainly Isaiah, often refer to the ultimate future of humanity. And the day of exile in Babylon is the classic historical example, archetype, allegory of the final days of the end of the world. In fact, both of them are referred to as, in Hebrew, Yom HaHu, that day. And it's so infamous that you only have to say Yom HaHu to think first of Babylon, then of the end of the world. Those are really the two types. And it speaks to another key element of prophecy, which is that history, too, is imbued with spiritual meaning. But it's not spiritual meaning that you can directly dictate, because if it were, then you wouldn't have to have the history. The history is the text, and the prophecy is, in some sense, a commentary on the history of the text that points you from its literal ideas and the literal facts that happened up toward the significance of it. And here is where people get very tempted to treat the thing like an encryption and say, well, are these the 7 churches of Asia in Revelation? Are these the 7 candlestick? I mean, there are all sorts of 7s in the Bible because it is the image of completeness and totality. If you have 7 things, 7 days of creation, for example, you have finished. It is done. And it's very, very tempting to say, well, who are these 7 women? But I think the whole point of history, which is reflected in prophecy, is that it only goes one way. Time only moves forward, and you can't actually foretell it in advance. You can only read it as it is happening. And prophecy allows you the lens with which to read it, so that when it happens, you can say, yes, this is not what I expected, but it is in keeping with my cosmic vision of the world that has been handed down through prophecy. It's a little bit like in quantum encryption. See what I did there, tying it back around. It's a little bit like in quantum encryption. You can only recover the data once. You can only look at the photon at one moment and then lose all of the ambiguity that went before it. So before Jesus comes for Christians, all of these prophecies have multiple different readings. Once Jesus comes, they definitely all funnel into one reading. And history does this. It makes things definite. There's a passage in That Hideous Strength that is all about this that I won't quote at length because I want to get on with it here. But basically, this is the idea that everything is narrowing to a point all the time. This is true when we observe quantum entities, that they resolve from states of ambiguity to states of determined quantity, that they occupy a particular place the closer we observe them. And it's also, I would suggest, true of prophecy, that it is unfolding in exactly that quantum way, so that once it has happened, then you can look back and decrypt it. Then it becomes a form of encryption after the thing has been fulfilled, but in the future, it is always a matter of translation. So we begin from a stance of translation, we move toward a stance of encryption once history has delivered its verdict. I think that was a really cool question, Blaine, and I think, if I may say so, it was a kind of cool answer too. Hope you enjoyed this. I hope you like words generally. I will take all your translation questions at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can sign up to get my newsletter there. You can sign up to be a paid subscriber if you like and support my work, which I deeply appreciate, truly. And there are other goodies that you get, like an audiobook of me reading Paradise Lost and other fun stuff. You can comment on essays as a paid subscriber. But any kind of subscriber, paid or free, can DM me or email me, because I'm so nice, and ask me questions. I would love to know your questions about translation as we do more of these week by week. That's it for me for now. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.